and we're gonna do a video breakdown of Neeraj Chopra. So you guys probably saw his recent throw from I think it was his last Diamond League meet. I forget exactly what the meet was, but it was a 88 89 meter throw. I think it was 88.88. So I'm gonna pull it up really quick. I'm gonna share my screen. So just like a quick little like context here. I'm gonna go through kind of just how I normally break down a video, kind of the things I look for, and then kind of talk a little bit about how Chopra breaks the rules a little bit. Breaks the rules, right? I say that with a grain of salt, because I think it's important to watch throwers like Neeraj Chopra to understand what the rules really are. I think there's a lot of kind of like cut and dry cues and concepts that are taught in Javelin that maybe you guys have been taught previously that you'll see just don't really hold up when you actually watch what happens in elite throwing videos. So let's just watch this through really quick. So going all the way back to the beginning. So you guys, if you've watched through the video course, you guys know that I break the throw up into kind of 8 phases, right? We have the carry phase, which is this initial run up. Then we have the drawback, right? Drawback position right here. Then we move through the crossovers, right? Chopra takes just a couple crossovers into his penultimate step, which is this big takeoff step in his last crossover. Then we have back foot contact, block foot plant, maximal layback position, and then release and follow through. So those are kind of the eight pieces of the throw that I look at, and I have very specific things that I look for in each of those 8 phases. So with the carry phase, the first big thing that I'm looking for is you're setting your approach rhythm from the beginning. So do you have a set approach rhythm? Right? Do you count your steps? Do you know the exact step that you're drawing back on? Do you know the step you're taking your penultimate step from? And do you know kind of like the cadence of how you count that all out? So I recommend counting left steps only, and then drawing back on a left step. And you obviously take your penultimate step off a left step. So if we watch Chopra here, right, he takes, right, we'll actually just go back. Let's just kind of step by step here. So counting his steps kind of the way I do, we have left 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6 is where he draws back. And then he has 1 crossover, 2 crossovers is his penultimate step into back foot contact. So if we watch that here, right, full speed, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, throw. And right, Chopra, obviously, he has his own way of counting that, his own rhythm. But I think it's really powerful that you have this backbone of rhythm in your throw. 1 and 2 and 3 and drawback, 1 and 2 penultimate throw, right? There's a cadence to that that serves as your foundation for movement, right? Javelin is about getting into the right positions at the right time. So having a rhythm that you're following, it lets you keep your throw on beat, right? It's, you can think of the rhythm, right? If you guys are into music or anything, right? The rhythm, it's the drummer keeping the beat so that the rest of the band can play around it and be on time and play in unison and in sync. So right, there's the rhythm sets the stage for harmonious energy transfer in the throw. So that's the idea of the carry phase, right? So it sets the rhythm. The last big thing is it sets the speed. So if you watch Chopra through this, you'll notice right out of the gate, he's basically at his full speed. He's not starting slow and then speeding up through his throw. He comes out of the gate, right? He takes these couple little like stutter steps in the beginning, but now boom, he's at his speed. He kind of coasts through it. And it's not about going as fast as possible. It's about it's not how fast can you run, it's how fast can you move easily in the context of your form and technique. So Chopra is a fast thrower, But what you see is that right out of the gate, right, he gets that easy, light, bouncy, call it like 75% effort, relaxed speed. And that's the speed that he works with through his throw. Now, with elite throwers, they do. I mean, I want to phrase this right. Like they do accelerate through their entire approach to a certain extent for some throwers. Chopra is a thrower where you can see as he draws back, he does kind of capture this little bit of right as he rotates backwards. He creates this kind of rotational acceleration, drives off that drawback step, and he does kind of speed up a little bit out of it, but it's not by trying harder. That's kind of the big point I want to emphasize is right. You do see some acceleration through his approach through his drawback and crossovers, but it's not because he's pushing harder or trying harder. It's because he's capturing kind of the flow of energy and rotation and the timing of it all with ground contact. So I've kind of talked about this with like Jan Zelezny's drawback before, where it's like the timing of his drop is timed perfectly with that right foot contact, and then he kind of explode out of it, and it sets this rhythm of kind of acceleration. So different throwers have different strategies for how they move through it. I think it's really fascinating to observe this in elite throwers and not just kind of right, not just say, oh yeah, the best throwers in the world do X, Y, or Z, because it kind of puts you in a box, right? But Neeraj Chopra, he's what I would consider kind of like this athletic speed thrower, and this is kind of a part of his form here. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I just wanted to make that note. So carry phase, you're looking at establishing rhythm and speed. So then we move into the drawback. So Chopra, what you see in his drawback is he draws back on this left step. So technically right here is where he draws back. Right. So when I teach the drawback, right, I always say make it as crisp as possible and as like on rhythm as possible. So it's happening in one step. That is a very good rule for the beginner to intermediate level. But like I said, the top throwers kind of have their own feel and their own rules that they kind of throw by. So if you watch Chopra here, what you see is he actually starts setting up for the drawback on this last right step. You can kind of see he's kind of starting to kind of tilt his body weight back. He's preparing that arm to go backwards before that left foot contacts. Now left foot contacts, arm goes back. Now generally what I like to say is I want to see right, you draw back on the left. I want you to be in your full drawback position by the time this right foot contact hits, right? So if you're drawing back on this left foot contact right here, by the time this right foot touches down, I want you to be locked out in your drawback. Now Chopra, he throws very rotationally and from a very wrapped position, so that's not feasible for him. So for him, he kind of splits up his drawback into two steps. So he draws his arm back here, right? His arm is behind him here, but now he uses the right step to finish that rotation. So in two steps, now he is in his full drawback position by the time his second left foot contact hits. So being a thrower who's as rotational as him, and it's, I say like swaggy as him, it makes sense for him to split that up. But what you notice is that it's not haphazard. He has this down to a rhythm and science. So he prepares for it on this right, he starts it, he gets halfway on that left, from that left foot contact to the right foot contact, and now from his right foot contact to his left, he does the second half of his drawback. So right, instead of just all of it happening 100% on the left foot contact, it's 50% on the left, 50% on the right. Right, so you can see now he's in on this left foot contact, he's in his full drawback, and then from here he's in his crossover phase. So that's the drawback position, right? So actually one more thing with the drawback. So you bring it back, notice that his position right? He's super wrapped here. Like the javelin is basically sideways. But what you notice is he's still following the big rock principles that I talked about through the course. So arm is long and locked out, right? I say keep a little bit of a wrap. He's in a big wrap, that's fine. And then the tip is at right that kind of eye level, right? I say between eye or nose level. It looks like he kind of keeps it right around eye level for him. And it's very, very stable. It's not wobbling around or anything. Now he's also a thrower, right? It's a little bit hard to see from this angle, right? Where I kind of say keep the javelin like mostly parallel to the ground. As you get to the higher level, right, especially like that 70 plus, and then really like getting to that 80 plus meter level, you notice that throwers are going to kind of have a higher drawback angle. The biggest, you actually can't really see it from this angle, from this camera angle. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is that you just want to make sure that the carry angle of the javelin is in line with your shoulders. So, right, if you have the drawback here, your left arm's reaching long, this is kind of the angle of your shoulders. You want to make sure that you're carrying the javelin in line with the angle of your shoulders. So you just don't want to have the javelin angled super high with your shoulders angled low. That's kind of where things get misaligned when you get into the release. So that's the drawback phase, right? So drawback, you use the drawback to keep rhythm, potentially even accelerate a little bit, and then you want to keep the arm stable with the javelin kind of mostly parallel, maybe a little bit with an upward angle, but keeping the javelin between eye and nose level. So now with Chopra, in his crossovers, we'll talk about the crossovers. So with the crossovers, the biggest thing that I like to say is, right, we need to think about the rhythm, right? Are you keeping the approach rhythm through your crossovers? And then are we maintaining speed through our crossovers? So the general rule of thumb that I have for both of those is you want to make sure you're doing crossovers staying on the balls of your feet. So if you watch Chopra, right, his heel does not touch there, his heel does not touch there, his heel does not touch at any point during his crossovers. And then you want to make sure crossovers are happening in the air. So crossovers aren't about driving off the ground. Crossovers are about changing the shape of your body in the air so that you can bounce off the ground. So Chopra is an awesome example of this. So, right, so he draws back here. We'll call this his first crossover. Notice how from, right, toeing off here before that left foot contacts, he's driving, he's swinging that right leg through actively before that left foot touches the ground, and then vice versa with the left leg. So again, he's a little bit of an interesting example because he only takes 2 crossover steps. His second is his penultimate, so you almost kind of say it's 1 crossover. But right, the principle remains. He uses active legs. He has that scissoring action with the legs, and he stays on the balls of his feet. And with Chopra, right, it's kind of less about like maintaining rhythm and just kind of about getting to the penultimate step. So like, what do I mean by that? Right, a lot of us, when we're kind of at that beginner intermediate level, through our approach, we kind of have this, right, what I'm talking about with the rhythm in the beginning, right? We have this 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 kind of way of counting, and we kind of bring that into our crossovers where it's 1 and 2 and 3 and drawback. Now we're in our crossovers and 1 and 2 and 3 penultimate. With Chopra, you can kind of see this rhythm of he draws back and it's drawback, 1, 2, 3, big step. So I kind of say it's almost like this like little stutter step rhythm through this last crossover. You can kind of see he like pushes off a little bit into this penultimate step and then gets that big sweeping motion. And right, for Chopra, right, it's way more about setting up the penultimate and his throwing positions and maintaining speed than it is about, right, having that robotic rhythm, right? If you kind of compare this to Roller, you'll kind of understand what I mean. There's a lot more swag in Chopra's crossovers compared to Roller's. a very, very much more like choppy or robotic, or it's almost like his legs are pistons pumping underneath him. So from the crossovers, we have the penultimate step, right? The big thing I say with the penultimate step is you want to make sure that you're accelerating through your crossovers into your throwing positions. Chopra does a great job of this. I say you kind of want this, the way you can kind of like measure your acceleration is by the length of your penultimate step. So Chopra, right, you can see his penultimate step is definitely longer than his crossovers. But it's not like it's not super, super long, but it gets the job done for him. He's definitely more of a rotational thrower, and I think that that's kind of plays into how he approaches his penultimate step, right? A penultimate step creates this linear energy. And if you're more of a rotational thrower, right, you're thinking more about that kind of right to left rotational action, and having a super long penultimate might not be conducive for creating the most power for you. So what you can kind of see through his penultimate step, because he is that more rotational thrower, you can see how he kind of sweeps that right leg through and around, and he gets that left leg kind of reaching towards the left and kind of angling his feet out. So, right, if you watch his feet through this, you can kind of see that that rotation into the throw happening right out of the penultimate step. So, right, he kind of sweeps that right heel through in the penultimate step, and through that step, he's already pre-turning his foot and his hips to begin that rotation into the throw. And you can kind of see this with the angle of the javelin here. So where the javelin is basically angled totally out to the right. And now through his penultimate step, it's already starting to rotate back into the direction of the throw. So it's a pretty cool display of body awareness and tip control, and kind of like body javelin connection. But you can really see right through from that penultimate step through release, he does an incredible job of getting that javelin lined up for that moment of kind of that layback position to get the linear pull on the jab. So he sets that up through the penultimate step. So then we have back foot contact. This is kind of where things get pretty interesting with Chopra, right? He obviously breaks a good number of rules kind of through his approach, just being such an athletic thrower and a kind of swaggy thrower. But now if you watch a back foot contact, right? So when I kind of teach the back foot contact, right, you've seen it in the course and everything. I like to say you want to have a squatty ball of foot back foot contact with your left arm reaching long and straight in the direction of the throw. So, right, you can see Chopra, okay, right, he has that deep knee bend. He stays on the ball of his foot. He actually barely contacts the ground on his right side here. Right, you talk about like the soft step in the javelin. This is a prime example of that, where barely any of his body weight is on his right foot here. It's not like he's loading into it and then exploding out of it. He's kind of floating over it and kind of using the ball of foot connection to the ground to kind of just guide his body into the direction of his block. So he's using this more for control than kind of actually loading into it and creating power out of it. So he does have the deep knee bend. He does have the ball of foot. If you look at where his arm is when his back foot contact actually contacts, he's very closed off here. This is something that not a lot of throwers have the ability to get out of and maintain alignment. But this goes back to that point that I was making, where from that back foot contact through release, he is rotating everything, right? The system as a whole. It's not like he's just rotating his hips into the block. He's rotating everything into the block, including the javelin. So, right, that's an important point to make, right? Because you can literally see from back foot contact to block, his entire body, his hips, his torso, and the javelin all together are rotating into that block. So sequencing isn't necessarily the right term here. Everything's going together. But just because of kind of the right, the joint to joint layout, the biomechanics of the body, right, the knee is naturally going to lead the rotation. The hips are naturally going to have less range of motion than the thoracic spine, right? And then just because of the setup here of his arm being so far across the body, there's a lot more range of motion for the torso to rotate than the hips. So, right, the knee finishes its end range of motion, the hip finishes its end range of motion, and then the upper body finishes its end range of motion. But they all start rotating at the same time. There's a natural sequencing to the ending of reaching their end range of motion. Is kind of the way that I like to think about it. So, right, the left arm and knee, they're rotating together here, but the knee finishes its end range of motion. Hip finishes its end range of motion. Left side finishes its end range of motion, and now the arm finishes its end range of motion. So you can kind of watch that frame by frame one more time. It's like, okay, from right here, everything starts rotating. Okay, knee finishes its drive. Now the hip has finished its hip drive. There's still a little bit more room for the left arm to go, right? So now left arm finishes, and now he's in that maximal layback position right here. And this is where all that power and energy transfers into its arm. So that's just an important point from back foot contact, right? He starts off closed, but he rotates the system as a whole into the block and release to line things up. So kind of looking at how he creates that rotation. So I talk about this a lot, right? The purpose of the squatty ball to foot back foot contact is so that, right, when your back foot contacts the ground and you have forward momentum, right? If you watch Neeraj Chopra, this video is a good example. So his foot contacts the ground. Now it's stuck on the ground. It's not going to slide across the ground, right? The spikes stick into the ground and holds his foot there, but his hips are still moving forward. So as his hips continue moving forward, but his foot is stuck on the ground, this squatty ball of foot back foot contact position creates the leverage for the knee to drop down and in. So, right, we talk a lot about the knee drop and the javelin throw. That is not an active movement. The knee drop is, right, it's a passive reactive movement to the positioning of back foot contact. So if you can hit that ball of foot squatty back foot contact, right, and make sure you're reaching in the left leg, act like proactively, you're trying to rotate into the block. The knee drop is going to happen as a result of that. You don't have to try to do that. So, especially, right, the left arm positioning of back foot contact too helps create the posture so that the knee drop happens out of the squatty ball of foot back foot contact. But that is a passive motion. With the left arm, right, you see Chopra's reaching across his body here, but notice how he very quickly gets that left arm reaching forward. He's creating tension across his chest here, right? When we say stay closed with the left side, that's not necessarily the best rule of thumb, right? Because the role of the left side is, right, it's gonna, right, the left lat is gonna drive torso rotation, but even getting the left humerus, right, you kind of say, right, call it like that push-up posture where you're creating that chest stretch, you're kind of retracting the shoulder blades back. That creates tension across the chest to create energy transfer from that right to left motion. So, right, with Chopra here, some coaches might say, okay, well, he's too early with his left side, right? You want to make sure that the hips rotate before the arm starts to go, right? No, because what this left arm is doing, he's getting, right, when he goes from here to here, he's creating chest stretch. And now, because he has that chest stretch, the torso can be pulled by the hips and by that left side action. So this, even though it looks like it's a disconnected motion, it's actually creating connection through the chest. by creating tension and stretch. So right, it's interesting because some coaches might say, okay, well, he's too closed here, right? He's too closed off at back foot contact. But other coaches might say, okay, well, he's too open here because he's flinging his left side ahead of his upper body. And then right now he plants his block and his torso is at that perfect 45-degree angle. So he's not closed or open. He's right halfway in between. So it's just another example of how open versus closed is just not a good way of thinking about it. We have to think about connection through the body and timing into the block. And Chopra is just a perfect example of that, right? The real rules of javelin throwing are timing and connection and energy transfer, and then kind of like the architecture of positions to create a linear aligned pull. So the last big piece of this throw that I want to look at is kind of the block foot contact into release. So when you look at Chopra's block position here, I think this is pretty cool. He plants his block with a perfectly straight leg, right? His block knee is not bent here. But as he finishes his hip drive, his knee does collapse a little bit. And so this is an 88.88 meter throw, right? It's an almost 89 meter throw. How many of you guys get so hung up on a bent block knee like this, and you think that this is going to be the thing that fixes your problems, right? It's not, right? A little bit of a bent block knee is not an issue. The block is a hip-driven movement. It's the collision of the right hip rotating into the left hip. And as long as you are stable through that and can kind of come up and over that, and even Chopra here, right? Even in his follow through, he jerks his right knee through as he releases. So I like to talk about using the donkey kick follow through to kind of come up and over your block. Chopra does a very messy version of that. His block knee collapses, his right knee kind of jerks through. He does extend that left knee through release, which gives him a little bit of that up and over motion. Right. But this is by no means what coaches would consider perfect. But there's so much speed and energy and alignment behind this and range of motion and sequencing, right? Everything else is in place here. I would consider that minutia. Like I would not get hung up on that, right? Maybe this will be Chopra's path to getting to like that 90 plus 95 meter level. But right, when you look at this as an 89 meter throw, and a lot of coaches would say this is bad technique, but you can't get hung up on that. You have to look at the throw as a whole. So, right, if we want to get super nitty gritty with, right, why does Chopra's left knee collapse? This is something I've talked to a lot of you guys about before, is you have to make sure that you set up your feet to create space for your hips. So in this position, Neeraj Chopra, his hips are still a little bit closed and they have to rotate a little bit more. And right, they have to rotate while his center of mass is still moving forward. So because he has that forward momentum and his hips still have to keep rotating, it's during that last little few degrees of hip rotation from here to here that you'll see his block leg collapses. So it's right, he plants here, his hips are still a little bit closed, but right there is where his hips finish rotating. And watch from here, his knee doesn't collapse anymore beyond that. That's where he starts to extend it. So for a lot of you guys who struggle with like a collapsing block, a lot of it is just the timing of your block plant and the relative to the rotation of your hips. So if you plant your block before your hips have finished rotating, right, your hips need to travel forward a little bit to rotate. So that's where that little bit of forward collapse comes from. But as long as you can come up and over it, it's not going to kill your throw. As long as you have speed, rhythm, relaxation, and fluidity through your throwing motion, and then dial in the timing of everything into an aligned release, your throw is fine. You do not have to worry about those little things like that. Focus on the throw as a whole. So that's really the last little bit here, right? So he comes up and over, he releases, and right again, like I said, this follow through motion. How many coaches would say that this is terrible form? Probably a lot, and right, coaches could say, well, he's Neeraj Chopra, he can break the rules, it's fine, right? Right, he's genetically gifted or whatever. You have to understand like where this fits into the context of 89-meter form. And right, when you have speed, athleticism, tons of mobility and fluidity through your throwing motion, you learn the rules so that you can break them, right? And it's fair to say that, right, most athletes are not Neeraj Chopra, but every thrower can get faster, every thrower can get lighter on their feet and more springy through their run up. Every thrower can work on their crossovers. Every thrower can work on their range of motion and mobility. And then every thrower can work on kind of getting the feel for these positions, right? How many throwers are scared of a drawback position like this? They say, well, I don't even want to try that because it might break my arm, or right, I don't, right, that's so extreme. I feel like right, that it's not comfortable. But when you practice it and when you get used to it, you get better at it, and you gain control over it, and you learn how to use it. So it's kind of just an important frame of reference, right? Like, these throwers are not anomalies. They've all figured out, right? Neeraj Chopra figured out how to incorporate this into his technique, and figured out that it was really powerful. You kind of have to step out of your comfort zone to experiment with certain things like this. And right, you don't always have to view like experimentation with stuff like this as right commitment to a technical change. You can just play around with it for a session, and just see how it feels, and kind of take that trial and error approach. I think that's something a lot of throwers could benefit from, is watching somebody like Neeraj Chopra and kind of using the cue, right? Throw like Chopra, right? What does it feel like if you like copycat his technique? And maybe you develop some new feels and like kind of new technical ideas, right? You have the light bulb moment or a breakthrough moment. So that's where I'm going to leave this off for today. If you guys watch this and have questions, definitely send me a message. But I think really the big takeaway here is, right, even with an elite thrower, they still have this foundation of these big picture technical concepts, right? The technical foundations module in the video course kind of talks about like, what is that 90-meter javelin technique that you can use as a North Star? Neeraj Chopra definitely breaks some rules, but you see all the principles of those 8 phases of the throw there, right? Set approach rhythm, great approach speed, stable drawback. It's a rhythmic drawback. Crossovers that allow him to maintain speed and accelerate. They have him in the air. He stays on the balls of his feet. Gets a nice long-ish penultimate step, long enough for him. He's accelerating through that penultimate step. Then he hits a squatty ball of foot, back foot contact. He rotates into his block. And then he comes up and over his block in his release and follow through, and he lines the javelin up for an aligned release. He has a lot of fluidity in his throwing motion. He has physical capacity to move in the ways that allow him to do all that. So all those big rock principles are there, but then you can see on top of those big rocks, he layers on his technical individuality, which are not just idiosyncrasies. These are how Neeraj Chopra has figured out that his body operates best to create throwing power. And there's a lot to discover and uncover and kind of experimenting with that, and recognizing what the physical qualities are that allow him to do that, that you can also develop so that you can begin experimenting with stuff like this if you're not even able to try some of this stuff right now. So right, getting light and bouncy on your feet, do your barefoot yogs, do your mobility. Make sure you are developing your smooth, fluid throwing motion, right? Being able to throw with a dead arm. Those are the big unlocks that will let you kind of learn the most from a video like this. So like I said, any big questions that you guys have, reach out to me. If you guys like the format of this, I think this is a pretty cool kind of thing we can do, right on the days where there aren't many questions or any questions. So definitely give me some feedback on that. But otherwise, right, we'll have the same call, same time, same place next week. And I'm looking forward to hearing back from you guys about questions and feedback.